Happy Wednesday. It's good to see you. It's good to be with you. Let me begin by reading from Second Corinthians chapter 4. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 7 through 12. But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all surpassing power is from God and not from us. We have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all surpassing power is not from us, it is from God. We're hard pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. We always carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may be revealed in our body. For we who are alive are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that his life may also be revealed in our mortal body. So then, death is at work in us, but life is at work in you. Another reminder that the Christian life involves a sort of reenactment of the death and resurrection of Jesus. Every day we live out the implications of the life and death and resurrection of Christ in our own lives. We are jars of clay. God displays his life-giving power in us. God dispenses his life-giving power through us. Those are the 3 points of this lesson. We are jars of clay. God displays his life-giving power in us, and God dispenses his life-giving power through us. M. Night Shyamalan's film Unbreakable begins with a train wreck. Everyone on board is killed, over 100 people, except for one. David Dunn, who is played by Bruce Willis, not only survives the wreck, he walks away without a scratch. Instead of being relieved by his good fortune, he's troubled by this remarkable outcome. Why was he unharmed? And what does it mean? Into Dunn's life comes an eccentric comic book collector named Elijah, who seems equally intrigued by Dunn's survival. Elijah has reason to be interested. He was born with a genetic disorder that leaves his bones especially brittle, so brittle, in fact, that he is known as Mr. Glass. He breaks easily. Dunn, on the other hand, has never broken a bone. Even after years of playing football, he's never had stitches, never pulled a muscle, never been bruised, never has been sick. Elijah tells David that he's not like other people. He's been given an extraordinary gift that he cannot keep to himself, but must employ in the service and protection of others. For the rest of the film, Dunn struggles to understand and to accept his remarkable abilities and the destiny that goes with them. He's unbreakable. The film is fiction, of course, a comic book fantasy. There are no superheroes walking the streets of our cities. We are all quite breakable. We're a lot more like Mr. Glass than David Dunn. We're fragile and susceptible to disease, accident, injury, violence, germs, and natural disaster. All kinds of things can happen to us in this world that lead to all sorts of questions. Why did this happen? And why to me or to my loved ones? Who or what is behind all this? How am I supposed to handle this? How can we afford to reach out to the world when it takes all we have just to stay healthy and safe? How can we afford to reach out to the world when it takes all we have just to stay healthy and safe? The Apostle Paul wrote 2 Corinthians after surviving more than a few train wrecks in his life and ministry. The letter speaks to the harsh realities of life and about the unbreakable faith that sustains us through difficult and dangerous times. We don't know the particulars, but later in chapter 12, Paul catalogs some of the difficulties he has encountered during his ministry. He had been in prison, flogged, stoned, shipwrecked, starved, and abandoned. Paul is qualified to speak on the subject of hardship. As if all that were not bad enough, some of Paul's critics in Corinth were kicking him while he was down by suggesting that he lacked the credentials to be an apostle and that all the bad things that have happened to him were confirmation of God's judgment. They confirmed God's disapproval. In response to all this, Paul wrote this letter, both to establish his credibility as an apostle and to teach the Corinthians a proper perspective on hardship and suffering, a perspective we very much need today. We are jars of clay. Paul begins verse 7 by claiming we have this treasure in jars of clay. In this context, we includes not only Paul and his associates, but also by extension, everyone who bears the name of Christ. The treasure he's talking about is the gospel, not just the message of the life and death and resurrection of Jesus, but also the power behind the message, the power inherent in the message, the very life of God available through faith in Christ. Instead of jars of clay, some translations read clay pots or earthen vessels. Regardless, the point is clay pottery was the most common material for cookware, dishes, wash basins, and storage in the first century. Clay pots kept liquid cool and slowed the evaporation process. Clay was easy to obtain and to work with. If a pot broke, you could make or buy another cheaply and very easily. Sometimes people stored their valuables in jars of clay, assuming that nobody would think of looking in something so ordinary to find anything of value. If you've ever stuck cash in a sock drawer or under the mattress, you get the idea. But how are we Christians like jars of clay? Well, first of all, clay pots are quite ordinary. They were everywhere, especially in the homes of peasants and common people. Wealthy people used more exotic materials such as ivory, marble, glass, or fine wood, but regular people used clay pots. It would be like saying today, we have this treasure in plastic bags. We have this treasure in our Walmart bag. Second, jars of clay were fragile. Compared to marble, ivory, or even wood, clay didn't last. Since it was so cheap, no one really expected it to. People used a pot for a while, and when it got too chipped or cracked to use, or when it fell and shattered, they simply got another one. God has taken this great treasure, the life of Christ, and placed it in people like you and me, who are as common and fragile as clay pots. That seems odd. Why would God store something so valuable and so precious in a container so ordinary? According to Paul, there are two reasons. Number one, God displays his life-giving power in us. God stores his treasure in fragile containers, like us, to display his life-giving power. That way, it is clear that that whatever we accomplish is done only by God's power, by God's sustaining, strengthening grace. It appears that Paul was not an impressive person outwardly. He was not known as an eloquent speaker. He may have been small of stature, not very good looking, and he seems to have had some serious health problems. He was viewed as weak. He wasn't viewed as powerful. He was viewed as weak by his opponents. He was often on the receiving end of criticism, slander, rejection, and persecution. Yet somehow the gospel was spread through him so that the church was established throughout the known world. The only explanation was that God must have been working through him. God must have been working through him. It doesn't make sense to place something so valuable in a container so ordinary, unless, of course, you want people to notice the treasure and not the container. Imagine you're having guests for dinner and you decide to make your specialty, whatever it is. I mean, it's a family recipe that takes all day to prepare. But these guests are important, so you're happy to do it. When it comes for dinner, or when it comes time for dinner, you bring in the main dish, you set it down in the middle of the table, and your guests exclaim, "Oh my, look at that. Look at that. What a beautiful serving bowl. Look at that dish." Then they spend the rest of the meal admiring the dish. "Where did you get that bowl?" They never say a word about the food. Next time you'd serve it up in a disposable foil tray so the container wouldn't attract any attention at all. So it is that God pours his life into ordinary containers like you and me so that people will praise him and not us, so that the people will see and hopefully embrace ultimate reality, what is true and good and beautiful, God himself, who is love. We are who we are only because of the treasure we carry within us, the life-giving power of Christ. The harder life gets, the more conspicuous the treasure becomes. That's God's will. The harder life gets, the more obvious and the more visible the treasure becomes. The harder life gets for us, whether it is normal stress, physical suffering, relationship problems, the problems of aging, the more obvious and visible it should be that we rely on Christ, and he is our hope, peace, and joy, and he sustains us. Paul says we're hard pressed on every side, but not crushed. We might say that Paul was stressed out. Have you ever just slumped through the day as if you had the weight of the world on your shoulders? Paul was hard pressed, but he didn't give in. We're perplexed, but not in despair, Paul continued. In other words, we're confused, bewildered, and mixed up, perplexed. Have you ever been so overwhelmed by the complexities of life or by some difficult decision that you were completely immobilized? Paul was perplexed, but Paul didn't give up. He didn't surrender to despair. If he felt despondent or if he felt despair, it was always temporary because he did not surrender to those feelings or emotions. He goes on. We're persecuted, but not abandoned. Fellow Jews, Romans, false teachers, and fellow Christians criticized and hounded Paul everywhere he went. Do you ever feel there are folks who are determined to make your life difficult? Paul felt that way, but he didn't give up because he knew that God had not abandoned him. We're struck down, but not destroyed. Struck down, but not destroyed. Or as William Barclay translated it, we're knocked down, but not knocked out. Literally and emotionally, Paul's been knocked off his feet again and again. Maybe you know exactly how that feels. Have you experienced one setback or defeat after another? Financial trouble, health problems, a lost job, or family strife? Paul and his co-workers were struck down, stressed out, mixed up, picked on, and knocked down. Talk about a train wreck. But they always got back up again. The devil and the world have done their worst to us, but we Christians are still standing. Or God placed within us. That power is never as conspicuous as when we're going through hard times. When we're going through hard times, this is especially when it needs to be very obvious and clear and visible that the grace and power of God are operating in us. Paul's ministry and teaching remind us that God never promised us immunity from the hurts and hardships of life. If anything, following Christ makes things more complicated and leaves us more vulnerable to hostility and heartache. The most obvious evidence of the presence of God in our lives isn't that we escaped hardship, but that we endure hardship with grace and dignity. We endured hardship with faith, hope, and love. If you're feeling hard-pressed, perplexed, picked on, or knocked down, it doesn't necessarily mean you're doing something wrong. On the contrary, it probably means you're right where you're supposed to be. In this crash-bang world, every time we get knocked around without breaking, we show the world we have something special inside us, the treasure of the gospel. Every time we get knocked around without breaking, we show the world we have something special inside of us, the life of Christ. As long as that's true, we're unbreakable. And second, God dispenses his life-giving power through us. God puts his treasure in jars of clay to dispense his life-giving power to the world around us. He works through us. Jars of clay were meant to be used, not admired. Brian Wilkerson wrote, "We have a sterling silver tea set at home that a family member gave us as a reminder of their love for us. It's quite old and beautifully made, and it sits on a stand in our dining room. There's only one problem. We can't use it. Before they gave it to us, they had it chemically coated so that it would not tarnish. Hot water will ruin the finish." God's not looking for sterling silver seas. That's a tongue twister for me. God's not looking for sterling silver tea sets. He's looking for rough and tumble clay pots, the kind that can be used every day in very ordinary, everyday situations. He's looking for the kind of pots that don't need to be tucked away in a china closet, but can be sent out into a crash-bang world, carrying within them the life of Christ. The church was never meant to be a china cabinet where precious pieces could be safely stowed out of harm's way. The church was meant to be a working kitchen where well-worn pots are filled again and again to be dispensed or to dispense their life-giving contents to a lost and dying world. It's interesting that Paul chooses the phrase given over to death to describe our mission. We're given over to death so that the life of Jesus will be displayed in us. Given over to death, that's the same expression the Gospels use to describe Jesus being turned over to the authorities for flogging and crucifixion. In the same way that God allowed his Son to suffer for the sins of the world, he sometimes allows his servants to suffer in order to offer everlasting life to the world. When a believer loses his job in a bad economy but responds with trust and perseverance, the life of Christ seeps through. When a Christ follower finds herself flat on her bed or flat on her back in a hospital bed, uncomfortable and uncertain, yet blesses those around her with grace and faith, the life of Christ spills out. When people celebrate a person's life and sing of the joys of heaven at a Christian funeral, the everlasting life of Christ fills the room with its fragrance. Like the Corinthians, we tend to associate the blessing of God with freedom from pain and hardship, but that's not the case at all. The blessing of God is that in the midst of pain and hardship, we continue to trust, obey, love, and live the vibrant life of Christ within us. Paul is reminding himself, his readers, and his critics that the ministry of the gospel is not about him, his speaking ability, leadership, or success. It's about Christ. We are clay pots. Jesus is the treasure. That was an important word for the Corinthians. For the same reason, it's an important word for us today. The Corinthians were creating a culture of celebrity around some of their leaders. They were concerned about which was the most eloquent, which one attracted the largest following, and which one was recognized by the society as successful, attractive, or powerful. We are prone to make the same mistake today with ministers and ministries and churches. Jars of clay are not meant to be displayed on pedestals for people to admire. Jars of clay are common, ordinary objects meant to be used. It's the treasure within them that deserves attention. Our weakness only serves to make the beauty of the gospel even more conspicuous. Our weakness only serves to make the treasure even more visible and obvious. Which of these four phrases describes you right now? Stressed out, mixed up, beaten up, or knocked down? Maybe all four. The world can be a rough place for a clay pot. Maybe you're feeling pretty banged up today. You're feeling like a cracked, chipped jar of clay. Don't be alarmed. You're not alone. What's happening to you is quite normal for followers of Christ. In fact, it's practically part of the job description. We have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. We're hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed. Perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not abandoned. Struck down, but not destroyed. We always carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. May God bless you as the life of Jesus is revealed or put on display in your bodily existence. I hope you have a good day, a good night. I'll see you Sunday morning at 9:30 or 10:30. And I do encourage you to watch on the church Facebook page the little 1-minute clip from Paul David Tripp on the Confessions of Humility. That was really good for me today, so it might be good for you too. God bless you.